Okay, so welcome to another one of our Simon's Collaboration Survey lectures. We're very happy to have Julia Kemp give us a talk today. Thanks.
All right, let me see if I can. Oh, did you hit record,
Yeah,
Surya?
yeah, we're recording.
Okay. Do you see, can you see my screen?
Yep,
Yeah, and you see the full screen thing,
the full
right?
screen. Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. So I'm trying to make it such that I see at least one person, because otherwise talking in the void is totally depressing. All right. So I had a bit of crisis moment to figure out what I should be talking about, because there are various things I'm thinking about. I want to focus on LLM reasoning, but I was even there thinking, should I go into depth with one of the results or should I go broad? And I vouched at the expense of being very shallow. I decided to present you a few results so that you get a bit of a brain dump of what I'm thinking about. And I'm hoping that with your physics brains, you can maybe capture some of the things. Some of the work is empirical, the things are observations. And I'm hoping that maybe in this circle, we could figure out some more general theory, something more unified. So that's the hope. But just FYI, because there's other work that I did. This is the work I wasn't planning to talk about, but nonetheless, it came out of my group in this, let's say, since summer 24, so in the last year and a bit. So we have 3 papers actually that are authored by Nikos, one of my students, where we analyze quite rigorously. So that's more in the spirit of this, I think, collaboration with, 2-layer nets or frozen feature models, etc. We analyze the implicit bias when you train a neural net adversarially. So you don't train it just with empirical risk minimization, but you do this double procedure where you have an adversarial perturbation and then you optimize against it. And we find all kinds of interesting stuff in the optimization geometry. I'm mostly thinking of Lenka there because it's quite related. She and Florent have been doing. Then we have one work where we do a statistical theory to show that whatever you do, you'll always be able to jailbreak a large language model. And actually, this is not too unrelated to the adversarial robustness stuff, because we use ideas from there to show that no matter how you align a language model under some reasonable assumption, there's always a way you can find something in the prompt to get it off kilter. Then we have one ability work, which is completely empirical, where it was a lot of fun, where we are just matching concepts in the data, like even reasoning concept or the language French or something like this, with attention heads. So we find a way to find the right vectors for the concepts and align them with the attention heads and find like a few, 3, 4, or 5 that are in charge of that particular concept. And then we can mess with them, switch them on and off, and we, suddenly the thing forgets how to speak in French or start speaking French, particularly when we amplify it, stuff like that. And then we have one uncertainty quantification work, which is for long form responses, where you don't just have a token probability that can tell you how certain the language model is. So we do some embedding work and look at the dispersion and some measures of dispersion and correlate it with uncertainty. All right, so that's what I don't want to speak about, but if any of your students or you have questions, please come to me and I can explain more on this. Here's the dump of papers that I wanted to at least try to mention today that have to do with LLM reasoning with post-training, via post-training, RL post-training. And the various themes are, and I will introduce the language a little better and give a bit more of an overview, but the various themes are, how do we sample so that we're sampling efficiently for labeling? So that's the first one. Then I will show the losses in what people now do, which is called RLVF, reinforcement learning with verifiable feedback. And there's a lot of open question. And I would even claim that nobody really understands why it works and how it works. And maybe I'm exaggerating, but I would go so far as to say that even the debate whether there's learning involved or just looking up is still an open debate. touch upon like diversity in the sense of various outcomes and what happens when you do this learning and how it gets narrower and narrower. And we have one, I think, quite nice theory work, the one that's called How Reinforcement Learning After Next Token Prediction Facilitates Learning, where we try to build a theory to understand what's actually happened when you do reinforcement learning after you've trained your model. And we have also fun work where we do this thinking not in token space, but in some software space with soft tokens. I'll get to it. All right, so let me speak about all these variants of reinforcement learning on language models. I think the oldest is RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, which went into all the early models that we know, like from GPT-3, GPT-2 even, I think. And the way they all work is that there was this realization with this paper in, I think, 22, where people realized that when you make the language model think, it becomes much better in what it outputs. And then, so these chains of thoughts have become then, people try to train a language model on these chain of thoughts and give them rewards and collect rewards and annotation. And of course, because then the language model thinks, there is also more inference time compute involved now. And so there is more of a scaling at shift and paradigm shift as opposed to scaling at pre-training time. So all this comes together, I would say, in the last 3 years or so. And the first kind of big paradigm, RLHF, is that you have a large language model training pipeline where you take the model, you pre-train it on enormous corpus of work. Then you even supervise fine-tuning, you put some good stuff, Wikipedia, all the stuff you wanted to know, math, etc. And then after you align it with human preferences by doing this RLHF, and the way it works is that you create various rollouts of the language model, let's say 2, and then you send it to humans or to Scale AI or to somebody and ask them to give a preference on which answer they like more. And just to illustrate, so this is before RLHF, right? So this is a comic view. How can I improve my relationship? Well, break up, it worked for 40% of people in my life. But that's not what people want. And after this RLHF, you get these more human-see, softer replies, which come clearly from this alignment data set. And how does it work? So the pipeline is as follows. You train your language model. You take this pre-trained language model. You make it generate data. You let the human score or put preference on the data. I like this more than that. You use this data to train a reward model that is able to give a score on what the human presumably is. And then you invoke this pipeline with this reward model where you train by having the model roll out, say, 2 responses, have the reward model rate it, and then reinforce the good one. So this is the up and down finger thing with the reward. And so you generate these response pairs, you model the rewards, and then you update your policy. Language model or policy is used kind of synonymously in this community. One question is, for instance, how to actively sample these response pairs if you want them labeled freshly. I mean, should you just have the language model sample, spit out 2 response pairs and have them labeled, or is there something smarter you can do? And probably every one of you who has worked with GPT has gotten from time to time this annoying thing where they ask you, can you please tell us which response do you prefer? And that's when you become the human pipeline, right? And so this into this whole RLHF setup where then you take the reward model and you have also, you try to have the model not go too far away from its base model, from its frozen original model. So you have another loss that keeps it a bit close to where it came from. And then you do this RL update with these preference pairs there. Anyway, so when you write it down mathematically, what you get in this RL, you got these rewards which come from the human, which we label as R, and then you have this other KL term which try to make the model not walk too far away from its base model, and then you optimize this kind of loss here where you try to maximize the reward while not going too far off kilter, right? And this is the human value oracle reward, which people then try to model, and this is kind of the penalty to move too far from your base model. But usually have access to this R star, which is where the reward modeling comes in, learning from preference data. And what one really cute paper in 2023 realized that when you write this reward model, usually people use a formulation of it, which is a Bradley-Terry model, and you can kind of do a little bit of massaging and math to actually get the same model be both model and the policy model at the same time. So this was this DPO, I would say, revolution. And then in the end, people optimize this kind of DPO loss when they do RLHF. Right, sorry, this somehow right. And so one question we asked in this paper that I listed first is, when we generate new preference pairs, should we just sample from the language model, or can we do something better to actively learn? And as it turns out, I'm sorry for this, as it turns out, when you sample and you want to optimize your reward, it turns out when you write out these gradients that come from reward modeling, even if it's implicit, don't align with the maximization of this optimization of this optimal loss that I have given before. So there is a gradient mismatch when you write down and look at the landscape, and which we observe. And what we find is that just sample these two responses, YA and YB, from your current language model, then on one hand, the optimization that you do and the reward modeling, the gradients of these two, which you can write down, are not aligned. And what we find is that if you sample in a linear combination between the base model, the one that you've never touched, the old one, and your current policy, then you are able to gradients and basically get better performance. So this was one of my earliest kind of forays into this RLHF and into this whole landscape of looking at the reward models and the policy optimization. So this is this one paper, Pilaf, that we wrote, which is some sort of gradient misalignment, which keeps haunting us. We keep finding these kind of gradient things that don't fully match when people do these optimization. Nowadays, we have another paper on that topic, so it will come back. But let's go back then. Let's come back to September 2024, which was, I was at the time at Meta. I'm still now finishing kind of my Meta time, and I remember this being a really for Meta, it was a very depressing moment. I think for everybody else in the community, it was a really uplifting moment when the O1 model came out. And then January, so O1 was a closed, we don't know how it worked, right? It just came as we could use an open source. And it could reason, right? It could do math, and it could do math pretty well. I mean, better than my, at the time, 11-year-old for sure. You probably heard that at this point, language models have won gold medals at the IMO. And this is like, what, barely a year and a half later. And then I call it the DeepSeek revolution, because in January 25, DeepSeek came out with their paper, but they actually published at least something of their training pipeline. And so in particular, what we saw is that now what people used for the stuff is what's now called GRPO, Group Relative Policy Optimization. And it's a little bit like RLHF. And I think the only difference is that the rewards now are not human, because we're doing math or coding. So there are rewards that come from, do I have a correct answer or not? And you can usually verify it or check it. So that's one thing. The rewards are RLVF, reinforcement learning with verifiable feedback. And the other thing is that people now don't have two answers, like, and say, is this one better than that? But this group thing came where people sample on, 32 rollouts during training, and then rank them, or not rank them, but give them rewards correct or wrong, and then do a reinforcement learning step on that. So this came to us basically a year ago, a little less than a year ago. I mean, it became mainstream, not that it wasn't known before. And this is what, and then a lot of craze happened on understanding PO. So let me go through it one more time in this graphical form. So let's say DeepSeek R1. We take a really well-trained language model, and DeepSeek R1 is well-trained. And DeepSeek before, I mean, the base model is well-trained, even on math. We make it roll out, we give it a math problem, Q. We make it roll out, G, 32 answers. And then we check basically whether they are correct or wrong. We subtract usually some average across this group, so we get these, and then we reinforce on these advantages. And the loss, when you look at the paper, looks like this. It looks a bit complicated, but in fact, the only thing you should care about is this AI in this formula, where AI is simply the reward of the current rollout, right? And it's normalized, it's the mean is subtracted and it's normalized by the standard deviation. I mean, for a statistician, this looks like a normalized random variable, right? So that's what they do. They do 32 rollouts. They compute for each of them this AI, this so-called advantage, and then they minimize this loss J of theta, right? So they compute the gradient, which you can strip away some details. So this whole clipping business and this whole, there's this term pi theta over pi theta all, that's some important sampling. Let's forget it. I mean, these are actually, as it turns out, not that important. And then at its core, what we do is we simply optimize this J of theta, this reward, right? The language model. And then we do gradient descent on this kind of optimization, which ends up being the formula that I have on the bottom, right? So we have this gradient of the log probability weighted by the rewards, and we usually subtract some mean, something to make it somewhat normalized. And in fact, this is, reinforced. I think people cite 92 paper, but this is an old kind of reinforcement algorithm, reinforced kind of. And what we do is to estimate this kind of gradient, we take 32 samples, right? These are the 32 samples that and then we check the rewards RI, right? And we take this kind of estimated thing and take the gradient of that. And this is now front center everywhere in all the reasoning models. Some version of this loss or the one with the clipping, it doesn't matter. They are all kind of giving something similar. The simplest baselines, the thing to kind of normalize these rewards, in the simplest form is just leave one out mean. So what you usually do is, right, you take all these rewards and then subtract the mean or the leave one out mean. And this is the thing that you reinforce on. Okay, clear, right? So this is GRPO for RLVF, right? Change of thought entirely synthesized. Correct answer, you get a +1. Wrong answer, you get a 0 or a -1, depending on what you're doing. And you do a gradient update on this thing. With this kind of thing, we see very interesting things happening during training. During this type of training, we get increasingly better answers, right? Of course, and we also use, of course, more test time compute because we roll out longer and longer chains of thought. As it turns out, during this training, you get longer chains of thought. So this was O1 from the DeepSeek R1 paper. Here is the curve that I mentioned. So while you do, this reinforced training, you get better accuracy, but at the same time, look, the chain of thought also becomes longer and longer. So this was observed, this phenomenon was discussed, and people wonder, is it necessary or not, or do we need such a long chain of thought? But that's kind of also then at test time, you have these long chains of thoughts. Okay, so this one point.
Actually, Julia, I had a question.
Yes.
On the last two slides, if you go back one more. So this horizontal axis is test time compute, and it looks like the scaling is logarithmic in test time compute. Should we view that as a success or a failure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm hoping I'm hoping this can be made more efficient. And there are people now. I mean, it was, of course, a success for O1, but that's a year ago. I think now we should view it as a failure because now there are more techniques coming along, summarize, sketch, draft, whatever, blah, 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 to make it shorter. The point is that the important point is that you have to do stuff at test time and you have to roll out. That I think was at the time a success or a victory.
And then on your next slide, the
ahead.
horizontal axis on their next slide is number of RL steps.
The horizontal, yes, number of RL steps.
Okay, so it's a different. Okay, got it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm showing you various. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, complete, and I'll talk.
Okay. Okay. So that's one thing is why does it get longer? The other one is what does this RL actually do? And I'll show you some graph. That will kind of that will show you why Bubeck is saying this. But basically, people start to think more and more that the intelligence or whatever the answer or this capacity already is in the pre-trained model, and we're just getting it out. We're just zooming into the pre-training data to get out what we want to get out. So that's a question. I would say this is not yet a statement, but it's definitely something people are very actively exploring. I don't know if there's now a consensus or not, but let me show you some work of others and also of ourselves. So first, let's look on the left side. And this is why people say this, I think. So this is a paper called "Does Reinforcement Learning Really Incentivize Reasoning Capacity Beyond the Base Model?" So that's what, April. And what it shows is the following. So when you number of samples, so we look at a metric that's called pass at K. So we have trained our model, we're done, we've done reinforcement learning. Now I'm handing it to the user, and the user can, of course, query the model once on some math problem, but we could also query it 32 times and take the correct answer or the best answer or the majority or something, right? Best, in this case, it's best at 32 or best at K. And so the base model, which is the black thing, is very lousy when you do pass it one, right? When you, at deployment, question and it has one chance to give an answer, it's not great. But if you allow it to give 128 answers or 256, it gets really high accuracy. So that's the base model without any RL training. And now,
sorry, can I ask a question about this?
Yes, please.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I've heard this too, and I wonder about how much it depends on RL training choices. Like, I guess the idea is the bulk model is not updated much at all, and what's changed is sort of the probabilities coming out of it. But does that depend on, like, you had this thing at one point in the loss of keeping it close to the original model, which you're kind of
No,
forcing it to do, but
off.
also things like the learning rate and the directions of the base model. Like, could it update more strongly if you tried to get it to do so? Like this.
I don't know the answer. I do know, I mean, we did some ablations ourselves. You can switch off the KL term for GRPO actually, and it doesn't.
Okay.
But the learning rate, I mean, people experiment. I think these graphs are pretty robust with all the changes that you mentioned now. I mean, learning rate or switching off the sticking to the base model. But I mean, there are many variants that people, I mean, I'll give you one, but I think the jury is still out. But I mean, just for, say, some common variants, this graph is pretty robust, the one on the left. And just so for the others, so the black one was the base model, and when you train at 450 right now it has 0.4 something accuracy, 42%, say. But when you look at the higher pass rate, it actually gets worse than the base model at pass at K. So not only could the base model have done it if it had been given a few chances to sample, but also the trained model now gets less good at pass at higher passes, pass it at 128. The graph on the right is from our own paper, where we number of unique answers the thing gives, like throughout training, and we kind of cumulatively sum them for some math. I forgot what it was, math, just a math data set, or maybe DAPO or something. And you see in the beginning, the RL, of course, is better. But then as you keep training and you keep counting these, it gets actually less diverse, right? It gives less unique answers. So there is this kind of notion of a diversity collapse and here we did another experiment where we again accounted for pass at K with all the answers already given. So we did some sort of accounting throughout training by looking at all the answers and summing up what fraction we have been kind of, what fraction is correct, something like that. And the point here is that, again, in the beginning, RL is pretty good, but then it's getting less diverse than the base model. It's sharpened, there's this notion of sharpening that seems to sharpen the probability distribution and at the expense of diversity. And so there's a paper called The Invisible Leash, why, it's not ours, but I thought it was interesting, why RLVR or RLVF may or may not escape its origin, right? So there is really an active discourse on this, and there is, the pessimists say that it primarily, RLVF that is, preserves the base model coverage, but doesn't expand it. So whatever the base model could do once you sampled it enough, this thing can do maybe quicker, but not more. So we just reweigh the probabilities, right? And can't discover fundamentally new stuff. So I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying we observe it more and more with just these vanilla RLHF. RLBF, sorry. And then the other thing that it gets even worse, right? That the diversity collapses as you train these things, and that people observe a lot. And I have to say, when you kind of setups or even more funky setups like teacher-student, I mean, I really see this happening all the time. I mean, this diversity thing just, people talk about at Meta, they talk about, you have your budget, don't use it wisely. So apparently it's known that you have a certain diversity budget that when you train your language model, it slowly disappears and you better use it judiciously, right? So is this true, is this not true? I don't know, but at the face of it, it looks true. So what can you do? Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
just maybe now. So this, the log kind of behavior of test time scaling, of course, is just a generic thing for search, search, backtrack, and one we'd like to kind of have some kind of very simplified model of what these things are doing. And so the things you said might speak to a model where the pre-trained model just has some large number of rules of deduction that it learned, millions, who knows. But post-training, the RLVR for whatever we do doesn't add to the set of rules, but it adds to things like its ability to, evaluate, did it properly use the rules? Let's try different ways of trying the rules. Let's do search and that kind of thing. So some sort of, again, simplified but more microscopic model to explain the data that you're talking about. Have you thought about that?
I have no answer. Yes, and I would love to think. I mean, this is why I give this talk. Question. There is also this whole new literature now on LLM as a judge, and LLM that that rewrites your stuff so that you then learn again. And it goes into this thing, can you bootstrap this process and get beyond the capacities of the language model? I would love to. I don't know any simple models that analyze this, where you can actually prove something.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's discuss it later.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to. It's not easy, but I would actually answer this question in at least some simplified way. Yeah. Anyway, so what beyond the leash? And I will just talk until until you stop me, because I don't need to get through all this, because whatever we can then, or I can give a talk maybe at the workshop, whatever. Anyway, so what can we do, and what can we generally do to improve this situation with RLVF? So there are various papers that we wrote. It was mainly for me an opportunity to play around with various aspects of this loss, right, and of this procedure. So I'm not claiming all of them are rocket science, but I had them and I learned a lot from each of them. But I really would love to have a good theory now, because they're mostly not theoretical. They all have a little bit of theory, but not one that's explanatory. It's just, anyway, I'll say something. So what
sorry,
yes.
Before you get into these, can I just ask one basic question about something I've heard in this domain, which is that the curriculum matters, like it needs to be a little bit too hard, a little bit too easy, and that changes as you go. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah. So this, I'm actually looking at this now. It comes often under the term of asymmetric self-claim, where you have a teacher designing problems such as just right for you as a student, and then you go back and forth and reinforce the two and so on. And this has been studied actually for the last 2017 are the first papers. And it seems to be the case. But then again, there are other papers that say, oh, but you could circumvent this by doing that. And maybe it's not the curriculum. But yes, there is an aspect to it, definitely.
Yeah, I guess it affects like the gradients. If you're way out of whack with what you can handle at a given time, then you're not getting any gradients from that. It's just not informative.
Also, yeah, there's one of these five there is about this. I mean, again, I'm happy to discuss more of it, but
okay.
All right. So what can we do? What can we do, A, to understand this, B, to improve this, and maybe to transcend this, whatever. So there's like three flavors here. We can look at these losses and see if we can improve them to make the thing explore more. There's this whole RL literature about optimism, exploration, all that stuff. So let's see if we can take something out of it. We did one work, soft tokens, hard truth, where we, instead of rolling out a token space, which really doesn't strike me as the best way to think, right, with all these words and or and so on and so forth, is there a way to roll out in some sort of more abstract space, latent space? And then are there losses where you could combine and use RL on non-verifiable domains? So let's go through all of them. Diversity rewards. Let's go there. So this is this paper here, where what we do is we observe the diversity goes down. What can we do? And there's this whole, decades of literature in bandit literature, where they have what they call exploration bonuses, where they simply add a bonus that penalizes when some answer has been visited too often. And this is this n that you see here, 1 over n. This is the term that, when you sample something n times, this is the variance, right? I mean, this is when you have a Gaussian, 1 over square root n is the variance when you have n steps. And so they say when you sample an answer this many times, you should add a bonus like this to kind of make up for this uncertainty and give some answers that haven't appeared yet a bit more of a chance to appear. Okay, so this is from bandit theory, and we just took it and we add reinforced loss, and we can also add it to the GRPO loss, doesn't matter. But this is an exploration bonus, right? And we did a bit of theory and we did a bit of proving in the bandit setting. But the point is, once we ran it on language models on some math data set, it did improve at train time, but it didn't improve so much at test time. You can see here, this is the thing with our methods called UCB, the orange one, and you see the blue one is the vanilla. So we had to come up with variants of the orange one, where we do a little bit more. We subtract a baseline here because we also want when a reward is when an answer is negative, we actually don't want to see it again. So we shouldn't encourage that one. So we do a bit of messing with the baseline. And when we do that, and then it's half empirics, I mean, a bit of proving, half empirics, then we do actually get an improvement with all our, this is Passet K, remember this diversity loss? And we see that we diversity less with our methods, all the ones that are called batch and UCB-con. These are these versions where we batch normalize that stuff. So that was one work. Where we then, the red one was finally where we actually improve in some math data set and don't just stagnate like vanilla RL does. So that's one thing. So you can add all kinds of terms to encourage exploration for this diversity thing. I frankly think it's just a patch. Okay, it will keep you alive a little longer, but eventually the problem. But then another thing we learned on this, or I learned, is that this term, this is the loss again that I wrote. And as Eva mentioned, this is actually a very useless expression when in the beginning, when you have a hard problem, you want to solve it, all your rewards are negative, right? Say all the R's are 0. Then you subtract the average, so you basically get no gradient. So in a batch where everything is negative, you don't have a signal. This is one thing. And also this term that you have, this V of S, allows you to balance the positive and the negative rewards. And maybe you can mess with those to get a bit of more juice. So we looked at this in the scenario when the rollouts are off policy. So often when you produce this data, you want to reuse it, or you want to use data that you don't want to do it online, but there is a reason why you're off policy, either because there's a delay or because you've produced a batch of this data already, train on it again. But when you do this, then it turns out that this baseline thing, what you subtract or add, really plays a role. And that was cute because we also found phase transitions here. So what we found is theoretically in some tabular setting, and then also in the bandit setting, is that when your data is off policy, so when you're a bit stale in your data, the take-home message is, right, you have the mistakes and you have the correct stuff that you learn from. And when the data is off policy, so mistake, then you better learn a little less from them. You should de-emphasize. So you don't learn from others' mistakes. When it's the other person, learn from their successes. This is how I try to remember the results. So we basically proved theoretically that there's a phase transition going on, that when you take this average and you subtract it, then you better subtract a little bit more, or a bit less, sorry, a little bit less, so that let me just look at the graph. To be smaller. Yeah, so you better subtract a little bit less, so you emphasize the positive stuff a little more, because then but otherwise you can collapse, the support of your policy can collapse. You just get less and less answers. And there's some cute phase transition. When you do the math, which is not very sophisticated, you see this, the physicist's heart should delight. You see these kind of phase transitions happening between when you subtract too much or subtract too little, and then the support of the policy collapses. So basically we did all this math and in some language model, and lo and behold, when the data is a bit stale and you subtract not enough, then the policies will collapse. So that was nice because there was a bit of theory, a phase transition, and then we could show that it's actually really happening But again, this is not going to solve the problem of RL just sharpening something. And then I mentioned these all negative batches, which are totally useless because there's no signal coming from them in gradient descent. And we looked at, for instance, when you train a Llama 8B model on the math data set, getting like 40 something, like 43% of all batches, right? The whole batch doesn't have a single correct answer and you just throw it away. And so we asked, what can we do with these negative batches that the language model produces? I mean, it's such a pity to throw them away. And so what we did is, again, we looked at, it's a little bit like this Pilaf paper, where we looked at the implicit reward and the actual reward, and we tried to reformulate things by the reward. If we would optimize this implicit reward directly with MLE, with maximum likelihood, what would we be getting? And it translates to a slight modification of this loss function that then with this reinforce would give the same optimization. Okay, so it's like some sort of equivalence of gradients again. And when you do all this math, what turns out to be advantageous is, so instead of giving 1 when it's correct and 0 when it's wrong, you give a negative reward that's confident. So in other words, you penalize the language model more when it's confidently wrong. And when you do this and it comes out of the math, then first of all, your rewards will now be more stratified in a negative batch. And second, you also make some improvements. This is the final formula. I don't actually, I mean, take my word for it, it's just reweighting the negative batches with some sort of notion of confidence of the model and penalizing overconfident wrong errors. And when you then this thing, lo and behold, indeed, it gets a little bit better later in training, interestingly, and especially on the harder data set, the level 4 and 5, the harder level of the math data set, we can improve with this. All right, so this was the theme of looking at the losses and looking what happens with this RL. You know what, I'm going to jump this because I do want to go to the soft tokens. So as I mentioned, one thing that's happening with this huge output of chains of thought is that it's all tokens, and many of them are useless. I mean, useless for the reasoning, it's just words. And so could we maybe compress this? And there are some works, right, trying to reason in latent space, in embedding space in something, but nobody actually managed to do RL with it. It's like proper RL, where you, during the pipeline, you roll out in this embedding space. And this is what we did with this work. There was a work, 25, it was an early 20, not ours, 25 work that demonstrate that when you, instead of having tokens, when you keep around these kind of, for physicists, superpositions, think of it as superpositions of tokens. When you keep those around, it reminded me very much of my old quantum computing days. So when you keep those around and reason in these tokens, there are some problems like graph reachability, which you can solve quadratically faster. So this really, like when you, if you ever did like Grover's algorithm, this really reminded me of this a little bit. So there is some benefit maybe of doing stuff in continuous token space. So instead of basically here's a transformer, a picture. What transformers usually do, they propagate this token through this whole transformer, and in the end they sample with a softmax. And so what we are saying is, don't sample with a softmax, keep around all the probabilities and keep this linear superposition, the weighted, probability weighted token around of all the tokens that you would have gotten. And a soft token, not just us. I mean, there was work on that one before. And now what we do is we try to just do the RLVF pipeline on these soft tokens.
Sorry. This sounds really, really interesting. So I want to understand what probability distribution it is that is being used to weight it in the middle of the process. Is it as if you have kind of an output layer for each of them that defines a probability, and that's how you weight it?
It's really as simple as taking right, you run a token through a transformer, it comes out at the end, and then you have a softmax layer, and then you sample. And we're saying don't sample. The softmax layer has, of all the 10,000 tokens or 100,000 tokens that there are, it has a probability distribution over them, right? I mean, before you sample, right? So keep that probability distribution instead of sampling, and stick this back into, you see this arrow, stick it back into the next embedding layer. Don't stick in a token, stick in the whole probability distribution.
Okay. So
it's just a vector.
So after doing a forward pass, you then use that when you do later inputs.
We stick it in, right. So we take that vector, instead of collapsing it to a token, we take that vector and stuff it in as the next token. That's it.
Okay.
And so again, so we were just hoping. I mean, honestly, this paper. It looks cute, and we got tweeted a lot, but it was in the end it was a disappointment because we got a tiny improvement, but not very much. But let me explain. There's one issue with this, because if you think about the RL pipeline, remember that what you do is you do these 32 or some number of different rollouts, right? You get these different chains of thought. But here, our thing is now deterministic because we don't have a probability anymore. We don't sample. We keep the whole probability distribution as a vector, as a superposition, right? It's like a quantum state, if you wish, but we haven't done a measurement. So how do we get the noise that we need in order to do RL? Because for RL exploration, 32 rollouts, you need some noise. You need some variance, some probability. So what we did is we just stuck a Gaussian on top of this vector, a random Gaussian, and that was our noise, token by token. Okay, so just, there was a little problem here to surmount, namely, where do we get the randomness to explore? But we added a Gaussian, okay, and these are our soft tokens, and we did the standard RL, the rollouts pipeline with some subtlety, and then we asked it in the end to give an answer. I mean, in the end, the answer is in token space. I mean, things with like thousands of these soft tokens, but at some point, either we force it to give a hard answer, or there is a mechanism by which it can signal to us it's ready to give an answer. Okay, because we keep like a shadow sampler, a greedy sampler there. And when it says, I'm ready to give an answer, then we ask it for an answer. Anyway, so when we do this and we train it this way, and we did all this great work, we got the following results. So in the end, we trained this language model with RL on these soft tokens. And now we can give it to you, and you have two choices. You can either just do inference in hard token space with chain of thought, or you can do with soft chain of thought inference and then get an answer. So we call this hard evaluation, soft evaluation. So the first message was, even though we trained it with all this soft stuff, turns out we can just do normal hard chain of thought thinking at test time, and it gets a bit of an improvement, a tiny bit. But what was so you see the little triangles on the left side, this is greedy evaluation, and the green one is a bit higher than the blue normal one. So it shows that with greedy evaluation, we get a tiny advantage. This is some GSM-8K, I think. We did it on various math data sets. But the interesting thing is that we kept diversity for longer with this soft training here. So this is the standard curve that I showed before with the diversity, where the base model catches up. And we see that ours, we have another version called fuzzy and soft, they keep their diversity a bit longer in both cases. So that was cute, but unfortunately we didn't get as much for our buck than we hoped for, but there's something that we could show for anyway. And the point is, it was the first time somebody could do this scalable, this RL in the soft token space. So maybe it will still be useful for something. We'll have to see. Anyway, so as I said, in this last year, there's thousands of papers written on various versions of GRPO and curated synthetic reasoning. And is it better to just find the right synthetic data and then do SFT, or do we need to do RL? And this whole thing of weird papers where they say even you can just do RL on one prompt, or you can even have random rewards or whatever. And then often it's not clear whether it has to do with the fact, basically anything you do on the Quen models will work. So there is also something with the Quen models where people suspect there's a lot of contamination going on. So it's very hard to do proper research because a lot of stuff is not known, like the training data and so on. And so when we try to, paper by Cengiz, I don't know if Cengiz is here because I only see a little square there. Cengiz and others, where they actually try to do this a little more, let's just see what happens, let's control the training data. And I think this is a fully empirical paper where they just control the training data, they look at the training data, and then they do this RL. And what they find is that RL, here's the second yellow, RL algorithms consistently converge towards a dominant output distribution and in the pre-training data. So there were various different formats in the pre-training data that they used, and then this RL would just zoom in on one of them, right? So again, it was still empirical work, but it was, I think, very cute because it emphasized it strengthened the viewpoint that RL does nothing but look up in the training data, more or less. But not only, because certain reasoning capacities generalize across tasks. So it's a very nice, clean study that everybody to read, especially since Cengiz is part of our collaboration. But from this, so we tried to then we really wanted to go a step further and try to really see what the hell is going on with this RL. Can we find an isolated toy problem which we can analyze so we understand two things? We understand why RL works so magically well, and we also understand why the token length goes up like this, the graph there on top on the right. So chain of thought length increase we want, because that one people just they swear by it. I mean, there is this whole thread of research where people, when the thing hasn't thought enough, they inject a token, wait, or keep on thinking and so on to make it think a little more, right? The test time, naive test time scaling, right? So we wanted to understand what's happening. So I wanted to spend a few minutes, if I have them, maybe 5 or 6. Do I have 5 or 6 minutes?
Yeah,
So,
definitely. You have even
Yeah.
longer if you want. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to spend it on this because there's some theory in this. Learning after next token prediction facilitates learning. This is basically the only real theory paper we wrote. So here's a setup. We wanted to find something to understand the length increase and learning. So we are assuming that these long patterns are easier to learn from, and they're already in the training data. Okay, so we have training data. It has a lot of short garbage, and it has some long good data, which teaches you something, right? And to explain why is it difficult for a model to just generalize if it's only pre-trained, next token prediction, like pre-training, not RL, then we want to understand how RL actually leads to this rapid improvement and why we get this length increase. Okay, so what do? We chose a simple problem, which is very cute, but and you know, pretty much often used in theoretical computer science and elsewhere for these separations. It's a parity problem. So we take d bits 0, 1, or what do we do? Minus 1, 1, okay? And we want the parity, so the product of these bits, that's the correct answer. This is our task. And we give 2 sets of data. Some of the data, a fraction of the data, is just short. It just has the input, the blue input. It has the output at the end of sequence token. That's some fraction of the samples. And then we have long samples, which give me all the partial parities. So the first one, the first times the second, the first times the second times the third, so forth. And presumably it's easier to learn from the second one. In fact, there are hardness results for I mean, at least for limited capacity models that show that you can't learn these parities efficiently from just these short sequences. But there are other works that show that from the long sequences, so that's Iran Malach showed this last year, you actually can learn it with some, some transformer. So we know these 2 things, and we now have a mixture of data, and presumably this is like, this is like the internet, right? When you learn from the internet, there are good demonstrations and long and good, they explain how to do it, and a lot of short ones that don't. So that's what we're modeling. And then what we do is we do next token prediction on this, literally on this data set, and we see what happens. And when we do next token prediction on this data set, it will depend on the fraction. So p cot underscore cot is the fraction of long data. Okay, so p cot equal 1 would be everything is a long demonstrations, and p cot 0.1 is only, or 0.05 is only 5% of data have this long demonstrations in the pre-training set. And we train a transformer here. In this case is GPT-2 depth 4 with 32 attention heads and embedding dimension 128. And what we see is that the accuracy test accuracy after training very quickly converges to something that strongly depends on the fraction of long data. Okay, so this is for the moment, this is still empirics, but we'll prove this also that this happens. In particular, then you can see the probability that it generates long good stuff, right? Also, is strongly a fraction of how much good stuff, long stuff there was in the pre-training data. And then we have this cute phase transition on the right. This p-cot fraction, the fraction of long data is less than a third. It's very hard for pre-training. It just, the final accuracy doesn't go up much. And then there's this phase transition where it goes to 100% after 1/3. So this is just an experiment on this parity data set. But the beauty is that we can actually prove something about this. But before we prove something, let's finish the experiment. And now we do RL. So we first do a lot of pre-training on these various fractions of p-cot. And now where we do various, I mean, GRPO or any ways to do RL where we reinforce the right answer, right? So, and there it turns out the thing very quickly learns. So here's this experiment. Let me explain it though. So these are epochs in 10 to the 7th, right? So in tens of millions of samples, I think. And the red line is just, here we have, this is Pcon, sorry, this is something 25% of long data. So it's in this phase transition, it's on the hard side. So pre-training wouldn't learn anything. And you see the average accuracy is 50%, that's random guessing for parity. That's the red line. And then from time to time, after 5,000 iteration, 10,000, we do an RL loop. And immediately we see that the accuracy increases, right? So here is something where SFT, normal next token prediction, doesn't increase the accuracy beyond random guess. But if we do RL after some pre-training, then we can boost this accuracy essentially to 100%, okay? So this is a phenomenon we want to explain because we believe this is what we are seeing when these people elicit reasoning with RL, right? It doesn't reason with SFT, boom, it starts reasoning with RL, what's happening? And also we trace the length of the chain of thought in the same process here, right? The same process where times wherever there's a star, we switch to RL. And we see also the length of the token sequence. This is for 50, a parity of 50, goes all the way up to 50 very, very quickly. And you see this length growing very rapidly, okay? So exactly the phenomenon we wanted to explain, we isolated it with parity with a simple 4-layer transformer that SFT for the hard, I mean, when the fraction is too low, doesn't learn, and RL makes it learn. To here is, I won't go into theory, but so we can explain, coming back, so we can explain these pictures basically. So what happens is, what we show is that we write a linear 2-layer model, a linear autoregressive model. So it's basically a model that we can analyze, that's the simplest model that's analyzable, that's still linear, where we can actually write something. And as it turns out, this model already exhibits all these phenomena. We can actually see what's happening. We can see all these things. So the first thing we show is that during pre-training, there is some sort of length calibration. So the model, when it's pre-trained, you can just analyze it. It will generate the long response with the same fraction of time as it would have, or with the same probability as the data shows, right? It just faithfully learns to reproduce the data in terms of when it generates the long chain of thought. And it learns success, I mean, of course, and it can only learn from long and not from the short sequences. So we just, we can just prove it. We write the theorem, we show that there is length, how can I say this, length calibration, so this probability stays, whatever it is, 25% or whatever. And then this phase transition at 1/3 simply comes from the tokens of the problem. You look at what the first token does, and the second token, you write this 1 minus 1 over p code over 2, and you get this 1/3 phase transition basically happening. And this is also what we saw in the transformer. What happens when we give RLs, we amplify correctness. So what we could analyze, we can't analyze GRPO with this simple setting, but we can analyze a proxy for GRPO, which is called STAR, which is an algorithm where we sample answers and give the ones with the correct rewards we keep and retrain on these samples. Keep the ones with the correct rewards and retrain. It's called expert iteration, basically, where we resample from the model and keep the correct ones instead of doing RL. I mean, it's kind of like a proxy. And we can analyze this. And so all the theoretical results on one slide show that indeed poor pre-training performance when the chain of thought is less, the fraction of good stuff is less than 1/3. We can show this with this autoregressive model, and we can show this very quick amplification where you need only log of 1 minus p code over p code, so constant number of steps basically, get to accuracy close to 1, right? So we learn provided that we have some 1 over polynomial fraction of good stuff because of how the RL amplifies the stuff, right? So I thought it was, okay, it's a simple model, it's a linear autoregressive model, it's a simple setting, but we could actually prove all these things. And then we ran them on, we ran the whole stuff again on, meaning we ran an experiment on just a pre-trained llama model, where we took a GSM-8K, a math data set, we blacked out in a, say, here in this case, 95% of the data, we blacked out the chains of thought and then we trained it. And you see these dots there, it means it doesn't even learn the accuracy of the base model. But as soon as we switch to RL, this is really nothing engineered anymore. This is literally, we do SFT and then we do RL and we see this emerging these accuracies, just like we did in our theoretical model. And we see the length on the bottom, the length thought also grow. So hopefully we explained something with this little simple model. And I think, should I stop here? So I'm gonna jump over an empirical paper that we made that just looks at the chain of thought. And I want to get to Ava's question, because the question I really want to understand better is also this aspect of self-improvement, which we see with RL when we have a verifiable reward. But is it possible to have some sort of teacher-student setup where we see this amplification, the teacher generating a curriculum and doing some meta RL? So we have some experiments running there, but I think theory is really lacking on when this helps and how this helps and what you can do, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the open questions. Can you generate a curriculum with RL to solve hard problem? We call it the Riemann hypothesis project, because let's assume you want to solve the Riemann hypothesis and you assume the answer is somewhere a combination of training data. How do you generate a curriculum right from the training data to get there? So I have much more to say about it, but I'll stop here and just maybe flash the question. So can we transcend this kind of RL leash with various other methods like self-play, all this diversity collapse stuff? What mechanisms, can we prove anything? Can we generate better training data than what's already in the training data? Can we leverage several LLMs? All these questions I think and maybe resonate with some physics models that, lots of funky stuff is happening. So maybe some physics models could help. So again, these are the papers, and that's actually all I had to say on this.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Julia. That was an amazing overview of everything. Maybe what I'll do is I'll stop recording here and we can ask kind of questions just without the recording.